My wife claimed everything from her mother's passing, the family business, rental income, and trust accounts. Within one single morning, she turned and said, "You were good enough for the struggle, not for the success." I was sitting at our kitchen table at 9:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning in late September, watching my wife Natasha arrange a stack of legal documents into 3 neat piles while explaining with the calm efficiency of someone delivering a quarterly business review that our marriage had served its purpose and was now terminated. She'd just returned from her 3rd meeting in 5 days with her late mother's estate attorney, a man named Douglas Whitmore, who'd been handling the transfer of assets worth approximately $6.2 million into Natasha's name. The inheritance included a commercial property management company generating roughly $48,000 monthly in rental income, 3 residential buildings in Brooklyn worth a combined $2.1 million, trust accounts totaling $1.9 million, and her mother's personal effects, including jewelry appraised at $320,000. Natasha had been explaining the asset breakdown to me, her voice steady and businesslike, when she'd paused mid-sentence, looked directly at me, and said the words that would replay in my head for months. "You were good enough for the struggle, not for the success." She said it without malice or emotion, just a simple statement of fact, like telling me the weather forecast. Then she slid a manila folder across the table containing divorce papers already filed, a proposed settlement offering me exactly nothing from the inheritance, and a 30-day notice to vacate the apartment we'd lived in together for 8 years. I'd been married to Natasha for 11 years when that moment arrived, together for 13 total, and I'd spent every single one of those years believing we were building something permanent and shared. We'd met in graduate school where I was finishing my MBA in finance and she was completing her master's in urban planning. I'd come from a working-class family in Ohio, first generation to attend college, worked my way through undergrad and grad school with a combination of loans, scholarships, and night jobs. Natasha had come from money, old Brooklyn family money, though her mother Claudia had kept her on a relatively tight leash financially, believing children of wealthy parents should learn to work and earn their own way. We'd bonded over late-night study sessions, shared ambitions, and a mutual belief that partnership meant facing challenges together. I'd fallen in love with her intelligence, her drive, and what I'd thought was her genuine appreciation for building something from nothing rather than inheriting it. After grad school, I'd taken a position as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm, while Natasha had worked in city planning, both of us earning decent but not extraordinary salaries. We'd lived modestly, split expenses evenly, saved where we could. When Natasha's mother, Claudia, had expressed disappointment that her daughter was living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment in Queens, despite the family's wealth, Natasha had proudly told her mother that we were making our own way, that we didn't need family money to be happy. I'd admired that independence, that refusal to take the easy path. Looking back now, I wondered if that independence had been genuine, or if Natasha had just been waiting for the inheritance she'd always known was coming. The inheritance itself hadn't been unexpected. Claudia had been 76, in declining health for 18 months with congestive heart failure, and Natasha had been her only child from a brief marriage that had ended when Natasha was 3. Claudia had built her real estate portfolio over 40 years, starting with a single brownstone she'd purchased in 1978 for $68,000 and steadily acquiring properties through smart investments and careful management. By the time of her death, the portfolio had grown to include the 3 residential buildings, a small office complex, and various trust accounts and investments. Natasha had always known she'd inherit, had spoken about it occasionally over the years, but we'd never discussed what that would mean for our life together. I'd assumed, naively, that sudden wealth would be something we'd navigate as partners, that the struggle we'd face together would translate into enjoying success together. Claudia had passed away on a Thursday evening, peacefully in her sleep in the brownstone she'd lived in for over 40 years. Natasha had been devastated, had cried in my arms for hours, and I'd taken a week off work to help her manage funeral arrangements and family obligations. The funeral had been attended by over 200 people, a testament to Claudia's presence in the Brooklyn business community. I'd stood beside Natasha through it all, had given a eulogy praising Claudia's business acumen and dedication to her daughter, had hosted a reception at our apartment for close family and friends. Throughout that week of grief and logistics, Natasha had seemed to lean on me more than ever, had told me multiple times she couldn't get through this without me, that I was her rock. The will reading had been scheduled for 10 days after the funeral. Douglas Whitmore had called Natasha to his office in downtown Manhattan, and she'd asked me to come with her for support. I'd sat beside her in Whitmore's wood-paneled conference room while he'd walked through the will's provisions. Everything had gone to Natasha, as expected, with specific instructions about the management of the rental properties and the trust accounts. Whitmore had explained that the estate would take approximately 90 days to settle completely, but Natasha would have access to liquid assets within 30 days and operational control of the businesses immediately. The total value, as he'd outlined it, was just over $6.2 million. Natasha had cried hearing it spelled out, had gripped my hand tightly, and I'd assumed those were tears of overwhelming responsibility and grief. Looking back, I wondered if they'd been tears of relief that she'd finally achieved the financial independence she'd apparently always been waiting for. The shift in Natasha's behavior had been subtle at first, easy to attribute to grief and stress. She'd started spending long hours with Whitmore and with Leonard Ashford, the accountant who'd managed Claudia's business affairs for 23 years. She'd had meetings with property managers, real estate attorneys, financial advisors, all the professionals required to transition control of a substantial estate. I'd tried to be supportive, had asked if there was anything I could help with, and she'd said everything was under control, that the professionals were handling it. When I'd asked if we should discuss how this would change our financial planning, whether we should meet with a financial advisor together to discuss our combined assets and future, she'd said there would be time for that later, that she needed to focus on understanding her mother's business first. 3 weeks after the funeral, Natasha had mentioned casually that she was looking at apartments in Manhattan, nice buildings in the Upper East Side. She'd said our Queens apartment felt small and dingy now, that she wanted more space and better amenities. I'd agreed that moving made sense given our changed financial situation, had started looking at places we could afford together with a combination of our salaries and a portion of her inheritance. Then, Natasha had sent me a listing for a 3-bedroom penthouse with monthly rent of $14,000 and said she'd scheduled a viewing. I'd pointed out that was more than double my monthly salary and asked how we'd budget for that. She'd looked at me strangely and said she'd be paying for it from the rental income, that it wouldn't affect our personal budgets. That conversation had been the first real warning sign, the way she'd said our personal budgets as if we maintained completely separate finances despite being married. I'd asked if we should talk about combining our finances more formally now that her income had increased dramatically, and she'd said she preferred keeping things separate for now, that it was cleaner and gave us both independence. I'd felt a small knot of anxiety in my stomach, but had told myself she was still processing grief and major life changes, that this wasn't the time to push for financial integration. I'd agreed to view the penthouse with her, thinking we'd discuss affordability and make a joint decision. At the viewing, Natasha had signed a lease on the spot, put down first month, last month, and a security deposit totaling $42,000 from her personal account, and scheduled movers for the following weekend. She'd done it all without asking my opinion or discussing whether I'd even be moving with her. I'd confronted her that evening, asked if we were making this decision together, or if she'd decided unilaterally. She'd said of course I was moving with her, that she'd assumed I'd be excited about a nicer place. I'd said I would have appreciated being part of the decision-making process, that marriage was supposed to be a partnership. She'd sighed and said I was being sensitive, that she'd handled the logistics because she had the time and the money, and it was easier that way. The dismissiveness had stung, the implication that my input wasn't needed because I wasn't contributing financially to the upgrade. I'd let it go because I didn't want to fight during her grief period, but the knot of anxiety had tightened. The move to the penthouse had happened quickly. Natasha had hired expensive movers who'd packed everything in a single day and transported it to the new place. The penthouse was beautiful. 3 bedrooms with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, a gourmet kitchen with professional appliances, 2.5 bathrooms with marble countertops. It was also clearly beyond anything I could have afforded or contributed to, and that imbalance hung in the air unspoken. Natasha had immediately begun furnishing it with expensive pieces, spending what I estimated was close to $90,000 on furniture, art, and decor. When I'd commented that we were spending a lot, she'd corrected me. She was spending a lot, from her money, on her apartment. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. That correction had been the second major warning sign. Her apartment. Not our apartment, not our home, her apartment. I'd asked what she meant and she'd said, well, technically the lease was in her name only because my credit score wasn't high enough for the landlord's requirements in this building. I'd said my credit score was 748, which was excellent, and she'd said the building required 780 or higher for the rent tier she'd chosen, that it wasn't personal, just building policy. I'd later discovered that was a lie, that the building had no such requirement, that Natasha had simply chosen to put the lease solely in her name. Over the next month, as Natasha had settled into full control of her inheritance, the changes had accelerated. She'd quit her city planning job, saying she didn't need to work for someone else when she had her own business to run. She'd taken over active management of the rental properties, had fired 2 of the property managers Claudia had used, and hired new ones she felt were more aligned with her vision. She'd spent hours each day in meetings and property visits, had become absorbed in the business in a way I'd never seen her absorbed in anything before. When I'd come home from my analyst job, she'd talk about tenant issues and maintenance problems and renovation plans, rarely asking about my day or showing interest in my work. The balance of our relationship had shifted fundamentally from partners to landlord and, what? Employee? Dependent? The social changes had been equally stark. Natasha had started attending events in her mother's social circle, galas and fundraisers, and private dinners with wealthy Brooklyn families and Manhattan real estate investors. She'd bought expensive designer clothes for these events, had hired a personal stylist, had started getting her hair done at a salon where appointments cost $600. She'd invited me to some of the events at first, and I'd attended in my best suit, which suddenly looked cheap and ill-fitting compared to the tailored tuxedos other men wore. I'd felt out of place, had struggled to contribute to conversations about vacation homes and private school admissions and art collections. Natasha had seemed embarrassed by my discomfort, had made excuses for leaving early, and had eventually stopped inviting me altogether. When I'd asked why I wasn't included anymore, she'd said these were business networking events and I wouldn't find them interesting. I'd said I wanted to support her business and be part of her life. She'd said I was part of her life, but I didn't need to be part of every aspect of it, that she was entitled to her own professional sphere. The reasoning had sounded plausible but felt wrong, Felt like I was being gradually excluded from the life she was building with her inheritance. I'd started to wonder if she was ashamed of me, of my middle-class background and moderate income, now that she was moving in circles where wealth was assumed and expected. 2 months after Claudia's death, Natasha had announced she was taking a 2-week trip to France to tour properties and meet with international real estate investors. She'd said it was a business development opportunity, that she was thinking of expanding into European markets. I'd asked if I should come with her, and she'd said it was a work trip, not a vacation, that I had my own job to focus on. I'd used vacation days and offered to join her anyway, to at least spend evenings together, and she'd said no, she needed to focus, and my presence would be distracting. She'd left for France, had called me twice in 2 weeks, and had returned talking enthusiastically about opportunities and connections she'd made. She'd also returned with a subtle but noticeable distance, like she'd crossed some threshold while away and couldn't quite come back to where we'd been. The final escalation had come 3 months after Claudia's death, which brought us to that Saturday morning. Natasha had scheduled a meeting with Douglas Whitmore for Friday afternoon, had said it was just routine estate paperwork. She'd come home from that meeting looking resolved and serious, had said we needed to talk on Saturday morning. I'd assumed she wanted to discuss finally integrating our finances or making joint plans for the future. Instead, she'd presented me with divorce papers and the end of our marriage. Sitting at that kitchen table listening to her explain why I was good enough for the struggle but not for the success, I'd felt like I'd been kicked in the chest. I'd asked her how long she'd been planning this. She'd said she'd been thinking about it since taking control of the inheritance, that it had become clear we were on different life paths now. I'd said we'd been on the same path for 11 years, that marriage vows weren't conditional on financial circumstances. She'd said people changed, circumstances changed, and holding on to a relationship that no longer served her needs didn't make sense. She'd used the phrase, served her needs, like our marriage was a business arrangement subject to cost-benefit analysis. I'd asked if there was someone else, and she'd said no, this wasn't about another person, this was about her stepping into the life she was meant to have. I'd asked what that meant, and she'd said I wouldn't understand because I came from a different background, that I'd always be comfortable with mediocrity while she'd been raised to expect excellence. The class contempt in that statement had been shocking, a mask slipping to reveal what she'd apparently always thought of me. I'd said I'd never been mediocre, that I'd built a successful career from nothing, that we'd built a life together based on mutual respect and love. She'd said respect and love weren't enough when the fundamental lifestyle expectations diverged. I'd looked at the divorce papers, seen she'd filed the previous week without telling me, seen the proposed settlement offering me $0 from the $6.2 million inheritance. The settlement did offer to split our joint savings account, which contained $38,000 we'd saved together over the years, and acknowledged I had sole ownership of my 401k, which held about $96,000. So I'd get roughly $65,000 from 11 years of marriage, while she kept $6.2 million inherited during our marriage. I'd asked if she seriously expected me to accept this settlement, and she'd said it was fair, that the inheritance was her separate property from her mother, not marital assets, and I had no legal claim to it. I'd said we'd been married when she'd inherited it, that in our state, inheritances could become marital property depending on how they were handled. She'd smiled, not a nice smile, and said that's why she'd been very careful to keep everything in her name only, separate accounts, separate lease, separate business entities, on advice of Douglas Whitmore, who'd explained how to protect inherited assets from marital property claims. She'd been planning this from the beginning, from the very first meeting with Whitmore after her mother's death. She'd spent 3 months systematically separating her new wealth from our marriage, while I'd thought we were just adjusting to changes. I'd told her I needed time to think, to consult my own attorney. She'd said, of course, she'd expected that, but she wanted me out of the apartment within 30 days regardless of whether we'd finalized the divorce. I'd asked where I was supposed to go, and she'd said that wasn't her problem to solve, that I was an adult with a job and I'd figure it out. The coldness was breathtaking, this stranger wearing my wife's face talking about ending our marriage like terminating a lease. I'd left the apartment, had walked around Manhattan for hours trying to process what had just happened, and had finally called my brother Evan, who lived in New Jersey. Evan had listened to the whole story with increasing anger and disbelief. He'd never particularly liked Natasha, had thought she was cold and status-conscious, but even he was shocked by the calculated cruelty of what she'd done. He'd offered me his guest room for as long as I needed it, and I'd accepted gratefully. Then he'd given me the name of a divorce attorney he'd used for a friend, a man named Richard Sterling with 29 years of experience in high-net-worth divorce cases. I'd called Sterling's office that evening, had been connected to an answering service, and had left a detailed message about my situation. Sterling had called me back within 2 hours, said he worked some weekends for urgent matters, and scheduled an emergency consultation for Sunday morning. The meeting with Richard Sterling was eye-opening and devastating. I'd brought every document I could gather: our marriage certificate, joint tax returns from 11 years, bank statements showing the joint account, documentation of my 401k contributions, and the divorce papers Natasha had served me. Sterling had reviewed everything carefully, asked detailed questions about the timeline of the inheritance and Natasha's actions afterward, and then delivered his assessment. The inheritance was likely separate property, he'd said, because Natasha had been careful to keep it completely separate from our marital assets. She hadn't commingled funds, hadn't used marital money to improve inherited property, hadn't titled anything jointly. If she'd put my name on the penthouse lease or deposited rental income into our joint account or made any other mistake that commingled inherited and marital assets, I'd have had a claim. But she hadn't, on advice of her attorney, because she'd been planning this. Sterling had said we could still fight for a portion based on my contributions during the marriage, argue that I'd supported her emotionally and practically during the inheritance process, but it would be expensive litigation with uncertain outcomes. More promising, he'd said, was pursuing spousal support. We'd been married 11 years, I'd been a supportive spouse, including during her mother's illness and death, and there was now a significant income disparity. He could argue for substantial monthly alimony for a period of years. He'd asked about my income, and I'd said I made $132,000 annually as a senior financial analyst. He'd said given Natasha's rental income of approximately $48,000 monthly, he could make a strong case for me to receive somewhere between $8,000 and $15,000 monthly for potentially 5 to 7 years. The idea of taking alimony from Natasha felt humiliating, like accepting money from someone who'd made clear she thought I was beneath her. But Sterling had said I needed to think practically, that pride was expensive, and justice was about fair compensation for years invested in a marriage. He'd quoted his fee, a $25,000 retainer to start, with hourly rates of $650 after that, was exhausted. I'd felt my stomach drop because I didn't have $25,000 to spare. Sterling had said many of his clients had similar issues, and he could work with me on a payment plan, but he'd need at least $10,000 upfront to begin. I'd left Sterling's office feeling overwhelmed and decided to empty half my 401k to pay for legal representation. Over the next week, I'd processed the early withdrawal, taken the penalty and taxes, and delivered $10,000 to Sterling's office. He'd filed a response to Natasha's divorce petition, rejecting her proposed settlement and requesting spousal support, equitable distribution of certain assets acquired during marriage, and attorney's fees. The filing had triggered an automatic court date for a preliminary hearing scheduled 6 weeks out. Natasha's response to my legal filing was swift and vicious. She'd called me for the first time since handing me divorce papers, her voice tight with anger, demanding to know why I was dragging this out when she'd offered me a fair settlement. I'd said her settlement was anything but fair, that 11 years of marriage deserved better than being discarded the moment she didn't need me anymore. She'd said I was delusional if I thought I was entitled to her mother's hard-earned wealth, that I'd done nothing to earn it. I'd said I'd been her partner through grad school, through career building, through her mother's illness and death. She'd laughed, a harsh sound, and said partner implied equal contribution, and I'd never been her equal. That statement had crystallized something for me. Natasha had always seen our marriage as asymmetrical, had always believed she was settling by being with me, and had only tolerated it because she'd had to before the inheritance gave her options. The "you were good enough for the struggle" comment hadn't been a sudden revelation, it had been her truth all along. I'd been a placeholder, someone to split rent with and provide emotional support until she inherited the means to live the life she felt entitled to. The next escalation came when Natasha froze our joint savings account. Sterling had filed a motion to prevent her from unilaterally withdrawing the $38,000 while the divorce was pending, and instead of waiting for a ruling, she'd simply called the bank and frozen the account citing an active legal dispute. I'd discovered this when my autopay for credit cards had bounced, since I'd set it up to draw from the joint account years ago. Sterling had filed an emergency motion to compel her to unfreeze at least my half, arguing her actions were punitive and harmful. The judge, a woman named Judith Fairchild with 19 years on the family court bench, had agreed and ordered Natasha to release $19,000 to me within 48 hours. Natasha's compliance was technically accurate but maximally spiteful. She'd transferred exactly $19,000, $0.00, then immediately closed the joint account and opened a new personal account at a different bank. Sterling had said this was technically within her rights once the account was split, but the speed and vindictiveness of it told him we were dealing with someone who would fight dirty throughout the divorce. The 30-day deadline to vacate the apartment was approaching, and I'd been living with Evan, but I needed a permanent place. I'd started apartment hunting in my price range, which meant moving back to Queens or even farther out to afford a one-bedroom. After years in a Central Park penthouse, the studio apartments I was viewing felt like prison cells. The contrast between my declining living situation and Natasha's expanding wealth was a daily humiliation. Then came the discovery that Natasha had already started dating. A mutual friend from grad school, a woman named Iris, who'd stayed in touch with both of us, had sent me a hesitant message saying she thought I should know that Natasha had brought a date to a real estate investor event. The date was a man named Gregory Blackstone, heir to a commercial real estate empire, exactly the kind of wealthy background match Natasha had apparently always wanted. Iris said she'd seemed very comfortable with him, that they'd been affectionate and familiar in a way that suggested this wasn't a new relationship. I'd asked Iris when the event was, and she'd said last Wednesday. The timing meant Natasha had started seeing Blackstone while still living with me, before she'd even served me with divorce papers. I'd forwarded Iris's message to Sterling and asked if this changed anything. He'd said proof of a relationship before the separation could help our case, especially for spousal support, and asked if I could get more evidence. I'd felt sick at the idea of surveilling my own wife, but Sterling had said this wasn't surveillance. This was documenting facts relevant to the divorce proceedings. Iris had agreed to send me any other information she encountered, And over the next 2 weeks, she'd forwarded several Instagram posts from society events showing Natasha and Blackstone together. Sterling had said it was helpful, but circumstantial. What we really needed was proof the relationship had started before Natasha filed for divorce, because if we could prove adultery or prove she'd been planning the divorce while still accepting marital benefits from me, it would strengthen our claims. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Leonard Ashford, Claudia's former accountant who'd worked with Natasha during the estate transition, reached out to me directly. He said he'd been troubled by some things he'd observed and felt I deserved to know. We'd met at a diner in Brooklyn, and he'd brought documents. Ashford explained that he'd been doing Claudia's accounting for 23 years and had expected to continue managing Natasha's accounts, but Natasha had fired him about 6 weeks after taking control of the estate. Before firing him, she'd asked him questions about protecting inherited assets from a spouse, about how to structure accounts to avoid marital property claims, about the tax implications of divorce timing. This had been within 2 weeks of Claudia's death, meaning Natasha had been planning the divorce almost immediately. Ashford had found the questions troubling enough that he'd documented them in his notes, and he'd brought me copies. The notes were dated, detailed, and damning. They showed Natasha had consulted about divorce logistics while I'd been helping her plan her mother's funeral. Ashford said he wasn't supposed to share client information, but he'd been so disgusted by what she was doing that he felt morally obligated. He said Claudia had been a good woman who'd have been appalled to see her daughter behave this way, and he wanted to help ensure I got fair treatment. I'd given Ashford's notes to Sterling, and his eyes had lit up reading them. He'd said this was exactly what we needed, evidence of premeditation and concealment. With this documentation, he could argue for forensic accounting of all of Natasha's transactions since the inheritance, could subpoena Douglas Whitmore for his communications with Natasha about protecting assets, could build a case that she'd acted in bad faith throughout. The preliminary hearing became a battle over discovery, with Sterling requesting extensive financial documentation and communications, and Natasha's attorney fighting to limit disclosure. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Judge Fairchild had sided mostly with Sterling, saying that given the evidence of early divorce planning, Natasha would need to provide comprehensive documentation of all financial transactions and legal consultations since her mother's death. The judge had seemed particularly bothered by Ashford's notes, showing Natasha had been planning to protect assets from me while I was supporting her through grief. Fairchild had said divorce was unfortunate but legal, but deliberately deceiving a spouse while planning to leave them was potentially actionable and definitely relevant to support and property determinations. The discovery phase produced revelations that were both validating and enraging. Douglas Whitmore's communications with Natasha showed she'd told him within 3 days of her mother's death that she was planning to divorce me and needed to protect the inheritance. Whitmore had provided a detailed plan: keep all assets in her name only, never commingle funds, establish separate residence, limit my access to financial information, file for divorce once assets were fully under her control. Natasha had followed this plan precisely. She'd also been communicating with Gregory Blackstone for over a month before filing for divorce, though the messages were carefully worded to avoid explicit evidence of an affair. But the timing and tone made the nature of the relationship clear. Sterling had filed an amended petition including claims of fraud and bad faith, requesting not only spousal support, but also reimbursement of attorney's fees, compensation for my contributions to her emotional and practical support during the estate transition, and punitive damages for deliberate deception. Natasha's attorney had filed a blistering response calling our claims frivolous and suggesting Sterling was manufacturing issues to increase his billable hours. Judge Fairchild had scheduled a full hearing for both the divorce and the additional claims. The hearing was brutal. Sterling had presented a timeline showing I'd been fully supportive during Claudia's illness and after her death. I'd taken a week of vacation for the funeral, had hosted gatherings at our apartment, had provided emotional support while Natasha met with attorneys and accountants. I'd had no idea she was simultaneously planning to divorce me and was actively structuring finances to exclude me. He'd presented Ashford's notes, Whitmore's communications, the Instagram posts showing Natasha with Blackstone, and bank records showing the careful separation of all inherited assets. Natasha had testified in her defense, and the mask had slipped further. She'd admitted she'd decided to divorce me shortly after her mother's death, said it was because inheriting wealth had clarified what she wanted from life, and I didn't fit that vision. She'd admitted consulting attorneys and accountants about protecting assets, said it was responsible financial planning, not deception. She'd denied the relationship with Blackstone was serious, said they were just networking professionally. When Sterling had shown her the Instagram photos where she and Blackstone were clearly affectionate, she'd said photos didn't prove anything intimate, and anyway, she was entitled to move on with her life. Judge Fairchild had not looked impressed. During questioning, she'd asked Natasha directly if she'd used me for emotional support during her mother's illness, while secretly planning to leave me once she received the inheritance. Natasha had said it wasn't secret, she'd just been thinking through her options privately. The judge had asked if I'd known she was considering divorce, and Natasha had admitted no. The judge had asked if I'd supported her through the funeral and estate settlement believing we were still in a committed marriage, and Natasha had said yes, but that didn't obligate her to stay married. Judge Fairchild had asked about the timing of the Blackstone relationship, and Natasha had become defensive, saying her relationships were her private business. The judge had said timing was relevant to spousal support determinations, that if she'd been planning a new relationship while extracting final support from me, it showed bad faith. Natasha's attorney had objected to characterizing networking as a relationship, and Sterling had introduced text messages subpoenaed from Blackstone's phone showing him and Natasha discussing dinners and trips together, starting 4 weeks before she'd filed for divorce. The ruling had come 3 weeks later. Judge Fairchild had found that while the inheritance was technically Natasha's separate property, her deliberate deception and bad faith justified significant spousal support. She'd awarded me $12,000 monthly for 6 years, totaling $864,000 if paid in full. She'd also ordered Natasha to pay my attorney's fees of $63,000 that had accumulated during the litigation. Finally, she'd included a scathing paragraph in her written opinion about spouses who use partners for emotional support while secretly planning to discard them, calling it a violation of marriage's fundamental trust and dignity. Natasha had been furious. She'd immediately filed an appeal, but Sterling had said appeals rarely succeeded on support determinations unless there was clear legal error, and Judge Fairchild's ruling was thorough and well-reasoned. The monthly support payments had started within 30 days, and I'd received the first check for $12,000, along with a check for $63,000 covering my legal fees. The money was meaningful, but the vindication was more valuable. A judge had seen exactly what Natasha had done and had called it what it was: bad faith exploitation of a spouse. The appeals process had dragged on for 11 months before being denied. The appellate court had upheld Judge Fairchild's ruling entirely, noting in their opinion that parties to a marriage owe each other duties of good faith and fair dealing, and Natasha's conduct had violated those duties egregiously. With the appeal exhausted, the support payments were confirmed, and Natasha had to accept she'd be paying me $12,000 monthly for 6 years. The social consequences had been almost as satisfying as the legal ones. Word had spread in the Brooklyn real estate community about what Natasha had done, how she'd used her husband through her mother's death, and then discarded him the moment she inherited. Leonard Ashford, who'd helped me with evidence, had let it be known among other estate professionals why he'd stopped working with Natasha. Several of them had quietly refused to work with her afterward, finding her conduct distasteful. Gregory Blackstone had apparently gotten cold feet once the divorce details became public, had broken things off with Natasha saying he didn't want the drama and publicity. She'd lost the wealthy boyfriend she'd apparently left me for. Iris had told me that Natasha's reputation in our old grad school circle was damaged, that people who'd known us both felt she'd shown her true colors and they weren't attractive. The woman who'd been so proud of stepping into her inheritance and elevated lifestyle found herself somewhat isolated, wealthy, but alone, her social climbing hobbled by the truth of how she'd treated me. I'd used the support payments to rebuild my life. I'd rented a nice 2-bedroom apartment in a good Brooklyn neighborhood, not a penthouse, but comfortable and mine. I'd paid off my remaining student loans and rebuilt my savings. I'd gotten promoted at work to VP level, my career advancing based on merit rather than connections. I'd started dating again, casually at first, and eventually met someone genuine who valued partnership over financial statements. It's been 3 years since that Saturday morning in the penthouse kitchen. I still received the $12,000 monthly from Natasha, deposited automatically on the 1st of each month. I have 3 more years of payments remaining. I've saved most of it, invested it carefully, built a nest egg that's now approaching $400,000. Natasha's still running her mother's real estate business, still attending her society events, still pursuing the elevated lifestyle she felt entitled to. But she's doing it while paying me nearly $150,000 annually, a constant reminder of the cost of her betrayal. I saw her once, about a year ago, at a professional conference where our industries overlapped. She'd looked at me across the room, and I'd seen something like regret flash across her face before she'd turned away. I'd wondered if she regretted losing me, or regretted getting caught, regretted the bad faith that had cost her so much in the end. I'd decided it didn't matter which, because either way the consequences were the same. The most satisfying part isn't the money, though the financial security is meaningful. It's the validation that what she did was wrong, that a judge and appeals court agreed she'd violated fundamental principles of marriage and trust. She'd said I was good enough for the struggle but not for the success, had meant it as a dismissal of my value. But the ruling proved otherwise. I was good enough to deserve dignity and fair treatment. I was good enough to deserve compensation for the partnership I'd provided in good faith. I was good enough to be valued by the legal system even when my wife had decided I wasn't valuable enough to keep around. Natasha got her inheritance and her elevated lifestyle, and she got to pay me for the next 6 years for the privilege of throwing away 11 years of marriage the moment she didn't need me anymore. That's justice. Not revenge, not cruelty. Just the fair accounting she'd tried so hard to avoid, delivered by a system that recognized exactly what she'd done. She'd been right about one thing. I was good enough for the struggle, and I was good enough to win in the end. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.